Hello, my name is Buki Fatona. I am a doctoral researcher at the University of Oxford. Welcome to Phil-Sci-Theo, an 8-part discussion series on topics in the intersect of philosophy of science and religion. Hello, welcome to this episode of Phil-Sci-Theo. With me today is Professor Alister McGrath. He works in science and religion here at the University of Oxford. Good afternoon, Professor McGrath.
It's very nice to be here. Thank you.
Thank you for joining us. Could you tell us a bit about your background and when and why, as a scientist, you became interested in theology?
Well, I think I need to go right back to when I was a teenager, when I was loving science and saw myself as having a career in the scientific world, and set myself the goal of studying chemistry at Oxford because it was the best place to go. And at that time, I was an atheist, quite an aggressive atheist. In fact, when I read Richard Dawkins, I get quite nostalgic because I used to be like that myself. But when I arrived in Oxford to study chemistry, I began to ask some awkward questions, like, was atheism really that quite straightforward? Were there other possibilities? And to cut a very long story short, I really began to realize that Christianity had much more going for it than I'd realized. So if you like, I now find myself in a very interesting position, which was I was committed to doing science, and I discovered Christianity. And how on earth could I hold these two things together? I think initially I assumed that probably I had to compartmentalize my mind. However, happily, I did find ways to sorting that out. So in many ways, my own personal history has made me interested in the relation of science and faith, science and religion, because it was a question that mattered to me personally. And therefore, I felt it was very, very good to invest in this. And in fact, what really happened was that I became so interested in studying theology that after I did my doctorate in natural sciences, I switched to theology. So basically, it's a trajectory of moving away from science to theology, not because I'd lost interest in science, but because I needed to do theology to kind of understand the relationship of science and religion.
Thank you. And do you see any tensions between science and religion, or science and theology? And if you do, how do you navigate any of those tensions?
Well, I think there are always going to be tensions between any two disciplines because very often they use different research methods or they have different operating assumptions. So I think that's always going to be an issue. But of course, we are really living in the aftermath of the conflict narrative, whereby people naturally presupposed there is a tension between science and religion. Now, historically, that is a little bit vulnerable, and in fact, in recent years, we've moved away from that. But it's a very good question to explore, because obviously we have to ask what is a viable way to hold together science and religion. And I was very fortunate. When I was here at Oxford, I was based at Wadham College. And one of the senior fellows of Wadham College was Charles A. Coulson, who was then Rouse Ball Professor of Mathematics, and he became Professor of Theoretical Chemistry. And he had written a book called Science and Religion, in which he developed this model by which science and faith offer different perspectives on reality. And he talked to me about this. We were both at the same college. We would meet and he would talk about this. And actually, I found that a very good starting point for thinking about this. Science looks at these perspectives, faith looks at these perspectives. They're different perspectives, but hey, you bring them together in a multi-perspectival way. So that was how I started. And then I began to realize, actually, you need something more sophisticated than that. And I eventually came across other writers who helped me to develop this. But I think what I would say is that in many ways, the most helpful thing to do is to say simply that human knowledge is like a spectrum. There are different disciplines, they offer us different kinds of knowledge with different degrees of security and also with different focuses. And in many ways, what I would say is the best way of understanding how science and religion relate to each other is to say that each of them is offering us a different angle of approach to the natural world, which is limited, but at the same time enriched by its own distinct method. And that means there are certain questions science will not be able to answer, like what is the point of the world, or indeed, what's the meaning of life? Those just aren't scientific questions. They are certainly philosophical or religious questions. And so in many ways, what I would say is that what we need to do is to find a way of recognizing the distinctiveness of each of these approaches and saying we need to find a way of integrating their different perspectives because they're all really interesting. If you limit yourself to a purely scientific account of nature, it is going to be very deficient. You need to enrich that. So my own view is really that you want to have as rich a tapestry as possible that weaves together as many different disciplinary threads as you can. And that doesn't mean you have to resolve the tensions between them. You're simply saying these are all there and somehow we can find a way of bringing them together. And if we can't, we live with the tension. But it's not warfare. It's simply the difference of disciplinary approach.
Okay, so you're saying there may be tensions, but we can interweave these different perspectives to give us a richer take on life. So do you think there are overlaps between those different fields of perspectives? Are there anywhere where the fields merge or look at the same aspects of life?
I think it's inevitable that science and faith, science and religion, are going to be looking at the same world and perhaps seeing it in different ways. But if you like, it's a different angle of approach. And it does mean that, a scientist will look at, for example, a beautiful flower and say, here's my account of what's going on here. Whereas a theologian might say, well, I want to bring out the importance of beauty because it seems to me that doesn't really fit into science very, very well. Why does beauty matter so much? It's a very important question. And so I think there will be tensions in the sense that these two jostle side by side, not always resolving the issues, but nevertheless they can say their different approaches actually need to be taken seriously, even if at this stage we can't quite see how to hold them together. So, one option is to say, well, eventually we hope we'll be able to resolve these tensions, but it's more important to live with them rather than to close this down and say, that's right, that's wrong, end of discussion. No, we need to be aware this tension is creative because nature itself is so complex.
Your latest book is entitled The Nature of Christian Doctrine, Its Origins, Development and Function. In it, you use the philosophy of the natural sciences in your analysis. How and why do you use philosophy of science?
Well, let's begin with the why question. I use it because it's second nature to me. I'm a natural scientist. I think like this. And therefore, it always seemed to me to be interesting to ask the question, how would a scientist, or rather philosopher of science, approach the question of the emergence and development of Christian doctrine? Why is it there? And one of the things I've always reckoned is that there's some kind of convergence or parallel between the development of scientific theories and the development of Christian doctrines. And so the book we've just mentioned, Nature of Christian Doctrine, begins by exploring precisely this issue. And it begins by saying, look, if you read the New Testament, you have this sense that something new, something enormously complex has happened, which forces revision of existing ways of thinking. And of course, immediately using the language of paradigm shift, Thomas Kuhn. In effect, that something has happened which doesn't fit existing theories, so therefore you have to find a way of finding something better that really works. And you can see that process in the New Testament. You can see it in early Christianity. People trying to say, look, it's obvious that a purely Jewish model does not make sense of Christ. Therefore, we have to find a better way. So it's this sense of needing a richer theoretical framework to make sense of this. That's one area. The second area, of course, is the idea, which is very, very important in natural sciences, of inference to the best explanation. We have all these observations. What is the best way we can hold them all together? What's the best explanation? Recognizing that sometimes we can't say it's right, but nevertheless better than the alternatives. And again, if you look at early Christian writers like Athanasius in particular in the 4th century, what Athanasius is clearly saying is, I've got to find a way of thinking, a rationality, a theoretical framework which is able to accommodate what I find in the New Testament, in the apostolic tradition. And the key question, therefore, is what's the best intellectual framework that naturally weaves together these multiple threads of New Testament insights to give a consistent and coherent whole? And that is what Athanasius does. He says that if you say I can explain everything except why the Christian community worships Christ, which is what Arius had problems with, then you have a partial explanation, but a deficient explanation. And Athanasius is saying we've got to find a way of bringing all of these things together coherently. And that's why for Athanasius, the doctrine of the incarnation was so important, because it seemed to do exactly that. So that, I think, is also a very important theme. And perhaps the final theme to mention, which I think is also really quite significant, is that also it helps you to understand the way in which theology doctrine emerged and developed. It had to, because in effect, it's saying you cannot just enumerate all these ideas. You've got to find a way of saying that each of these important ideas is part of a greater whole. There's a bigger picture, and they fit into this. And certainly that's what the early Christian theologians were doing. They were looking for the big picture, a way of affirming all these important insights, but saying on their own, they're inadequate. We need to find something which holds them together naturally, and that bigger picture itself is really worth preserving. So I found all those things in the evolution of Christian doctrine, and it seems to me to give you a fairly helpful account of how this actually happened.
So you've just mentioned the philosopher Thomas Kuhn and his idea of paradigm shift. Could you give an example of a paradigm shift in relation to Christian doctrine?
Well, a very good example of a paradigm shift would be to do with the identity of Christ. Because what you find is that early Christian writers initially said, let's use existing Jewish models, what we find in the Old Testament, for example, a prophet, and see if we can use that as a way of fully articulating the identity of Christ. And they realized quite quickly that these just weren't good enough. They did a partial job, not a complete job, and therefore they had to find something better. And in many ways, the idea of incarnation, which is a distinctively Christian idea, is a new way of looking at this, which was not invented arbitrarily, but rather was found to be necessary in order to make sense of the complexity of the New Testament witness. In other words, existing approaches just did not work. And therefore the early church said, right, let us find a model that does work. And Athanasius and others fixed on the idea of incarnation, saying this gives us coherence in a way that other approaches do not.
Yes, from what I know of that history, there were many jostling theories competing at the same time. You mentioned Arius is one of those. How do you think the people like Athanasius and I think Augustine, how do you think they chose which explanation was the best out of these jostling theories and explanations?
I think what you see happening in early Christianity is an extended, both chronologically and geographically, discussion about which is the best way of doing it. And it takes some time to resolve it, but by the 4th century we see a convergence, that really there's a recognition this seems to be the best way of doing it, and actually that becomes a consensus. It's a bit like in the history of science. Very often you find science goes through a period of radical questioning. This isn't working. What are the alternatives? And in many ways, early Christian theologians were trying to identify what's the best way of doing it. And by the 4th century said, we think we've got something that's good enough to do. And that really is something that both Athanasius and Augustine would say, this is workable, we're going to use it. And that, I think, is a very good example of where a radical rethink actually leads to the emergence of a working consensus.
Thank you very much for that. What is Christian doctrine? These are some of the central questions of your latest book. And one is, what is Christian doctrine? And we'll go to the next after that, which is, why did it emerge?
Well, let's start by thinking about Christian doctrine. I want to draw a distinction between Christian doctrine and Christian theology. Christian theology is what a Christian theologian, like me, thinks. It's me. It's, in other words, my personal viewpoint. Christian doctrine is much more communal. It is what the Christian community thinks. It's a bigger thing. It's about what a Christian church or congregation or gathering believes is the best way of making sense of it. And so there's this sense of speaking on behalf of a community, not simply an individual. And that's why the creeds are so important in the history of Christianity, because it's not, this is what I think, it's what we think, what the Christian community as a whole thinks. And obviously, individual Christians will say, but I understand it in this particular way, but you nevertheless use the creeds as a framework. You belong to a community, you step into it, say, this is my way of thinking. Even though I might have my own ideas about how best to apply this and make sense of it, I'm still saying the communal belief system it's who I am. But even though I have my own individual take on this, I still operate within this framework. So doctrine is a communal vision of what Christianity is all about. Each of us may have our own personal understanding of that, but very often it's building on the communal vision and perhaps saying, I emphasize this or I place more emphasis on that because they seem to be important to me, but you're not losing sight of the fact that you are an individual and the community of faith is really important.
So that explains in part for me things like the Council of Nicaea, the idea of the community comes together. It does explain it to a certain degree, but who gets to have a voice in the community? So at the Council of Nicaea it was the bishops. Are they representative of Christians, or is there an evolutionary trajectory even in the people who get to choose, not just in the doctrine, but the people who get to choose which doctrines are orthodox?
I think in the early Christian situation, bishops were very often seen as being representative figures, very often intelligent and educated people. So there's a sense in which they were speaking in a representative way, saying, look, we think we can go along with this because it seems to really bring together everything that matters. But you're right to raise the question, because over the extended history of Christianity, there's been this enormous debate. Who has the right to make these decisions? Is it the local congregation? Is it the denomination? And if so, is it individual theologians or is it actually church leaders? And these questions are quite open, I have to say that. What I would say, though, is that, as Karl Rahner points out, the whole thing about, for example, the Council of Chalcedon is it's not shutting down discussion. It's saying, in effect, we found a really good basis for discussion, and we're going to use this as a jumping off point for our future reflections. So having communal decisions about what we believe doesn't close discussion down. If you like, it's saying we found a very good way of thinking about this. Let's use this to keep these conversations going.
So it sounds like there was a parallel between how science is done and how the emergence of Christian doctrine, and how the church fathers selected which theories or explanations fitted the best. Do you think that's because, in a sense, some of them were scientists? They used and thought a lot about natural philosophy, which then became, as you know, science.
I think there are probably two things going on here. One of them, you're quite right, is that some of the early Christian writers actually were reflecting on what they observed. I mean, Augustine of Hippo, for example, watched the behavior of fish in a local fountain and realized that they seemed to gather in particular places because they remembered that was where people threw food. So he began to develop his own theory of fish having memories, that sort of thing. So you can see that there is that. But there's also, I think, that in many ways, the scientific method does map quite nicely onto a standard Aristotelian view of natural philosophy, which is you observe things and you ask, what are the deeper patterns? What are the first principles that seem to govern this? So if you like, there's almost like an instinct to look for the patterns and look for the deeper explanations which help us understand why those observations are there in the first place. So although I would not want to say that someone like Athanasius is a natural scientist, that would be really quite ahistorical, he nevertheless has patterns of thought which map very naturally onto what we now call natural sciences.
That leads to the next question, which is one of the central questions of your books. Why did Christian doctrine emerge?
Well, it emerged because it had to. I mean, that's a simple answer, but I need to give you a better answer than that. I think that Christian doctrine basically was an attempt to capture the intellectual vision which lay at the heart of the Christian faith. And if you look at a writer like, well, for example, Charles Taylor, the Canadian philosopher, one of the points he makes is that very often you have a set of presuppositions or an intellectual vision which cannot be put into words, but has to be put into words. He uses this idea of articulation. You have to find a way of articulating something that actually can't really be expressed properly in words. And so the early church found itself saying, we know what really is important. We've got to find a way of expressing this in words. And so it's not just how we express it, it's agreeing the words. So that actually is really quite important. And that actually we see going on, the formulation of the creeds and things like that. And it's not saying we believe in these words, it's that these words capture or enclose or allow us to hold together something really important that we must never lose, because if we lose this, we lose Christianity. So if you like, it was seen as an identity-giving, an identity-preserving exercise, which was really about trying to preserve what matters. And if that is right, then it does follow that really doctrine is always going to be important, because it's always about making sure Christianity maintains its distinct identity, even in changing historical circumstances.
So it sounds to me like, from what you're saying, the role doctrine plays is similar to the role narrative plays in society. By having a shared narrative, we come to share an identity. Is that, how do you see narrativity in relation to doctrine?
I think if you look at the Christian creeds, there isn't really all that much narrative there, except for the central part of the Apostles' Creed, which tells the story of Christ. It very carefully identifies all the stages, and in effect saying this is the key story. And it doesn't interpret it, but in effect gives you the story itself. So you're right, we have two things going on at the same time. One is the intellectual articulation of what really matters. The other is, in effect, retelling the story, which very often you do partially through creeds, perhaps more importantly, through liturgy, particularly the Eucharistic liturgy, which is very much retelling the story and making connections with human existence, with where congregations would be. So doctrine is not to be contrasted with narrative. If you like, doctrine is the framework which captures what the narrative is all about, and also allows you to make sure when you read that story, you know what it's getting at. It's a correlation between, if you like, the narrative of Christ and each person's individual story. And by bringing these into connection with each other, you are talking about the redirection of human existence, which is a consequence of faith.
Thank you. So doctrine is the framework by which we understand narrative. I like that. All through this, what has been at the back of my mind is the idea of language, the role language plays in all of this. Going back to that idea of articulation, and also narrative and doctrine and the creed. So it must mean that there are, as we know, limits to language. How do they, or do they, pose a problem for doctrine?
I think one of the issues that you've identified here is this constant anxiety. We've got to use words, but the words aren't good enough. So in other words, if you like, there's always this realization that we can try and put this vision or this, early Christian writers use the word mystery, not meaning something that's irrational, but something that's simply too big to put into words. It hurts your head to try and understand it, So what they're trying to say is we've got to hold on to this, we've got to use words, but we've got to also realize the words don't fully or adequately articulate what this is all about. And that's why worship is so important, because worship is, in effect, about letting go of language and, in fact, moving to the realm of adoration rather than articulation. So worship is, I think, a very important counterpart to Christian doctrine, because it, in effect, reminds you that you are not just thinking, you are worshiping, and worshiping is a recognition you're in the presence of something that is so big that articulation doesn't do the job, but in effect, almost like prostration, does. I think that's why the link between prayer and worship and theology and doctrine is so important. They're all part of something bigger than itself.
So worship as participation that goes beyond articulation.
Exactly.
So what are the functions of Christian doctrine?
Well, I think Christian doctrine has a number of functions, and I'll just mention a few of them. One of them, obviously, is precisely what we've been talking about, articulating or putting into words what the Christian community believes, not in the sense of a distant spectator looking at it saying, here's what it is, but more in terms of participating. And this is actually how the community I'm part of works. So that's one thing, it's articulation. I think that's very important. Secondly, it's also a way of trying to, going back to our discussion about stories, it's saying, the stories create a framework which doctrine articulates, and then you bring that back to the story, read it again, and it's like a spiral. You keep seeing more and more in the story because the doctrinal framework helps you to see things like a lens that you might not have seen before. Then thirdly, very often doctrine serves a function which is slightly negative, which is, if you like, a barrier. It's saying, because we are this, we aren't that. And so if you look at the way in which early Christianity said, well, there are certain ways of understanding Christ, and some of them are just not good enough, they're inadequate, they're toxic. So we have to say no to these, and we use the word heresy to refer to them. There you're saying, in effect, it's about safeguarding, planting a hedge around a field, if you like, to preserve what is good, and saying what lies beyond is actually inadequate. So that's going on as well. But one of the most important things is this idea I mentioned earlier, which is doctrine is saying, look, we have a whole series of individual items of belief, but actually they're not disconnected. They're held together. And doctrine gives you the theoretical framework. It holds them together. For example, when you read the New Testament, look at all the words for salvation. There's a huge number of them. Adoption, salvation, redemption, healing, etc., etc. And what doctrine does to give you a framework, it says these are all different ways of envisaging or articulating the central Christian idea. They're each different, but they are connected together, all part of a greater whole, and therefore what you're dealing with is something that is a unitary reality, but is rich and complex, and also individuals respond with different affective responses to each of these different elements. So it in effect enables a greater connectivity between doctrine and believers.
At a point, I think you mentioned, you described doctrine as evolving. Is it still evolving? So can we arrive at new understandings, for example, of Christ, of the person of Christ?
I think what I would say is that doctrine is not a static thing. It's not as if it's frozen in time. It's a dynamic thing, but it can be expressed in fixed forms, providing you understand that as the church moves into new contexts and encounters new problems, as individual believers grow in their faith, they will very often find that even though they believe they are saying the same thing as a creed, they're actually going deeper. They're actually saying, this really works for me. In other words, it's about unfolding or enriching something without denying it. It's about using this as a base for growth, rather than saying this is a static thing which mustn't be changed.
And to take the evolution analogy a bit further and returning to your idea of toxic theology as what then ends up being heresy. So do we measure, evolution, do you think doctrine, the best explanations, sometimes the ones that win out, are chosen not just because they are more closer to the reality, or they are is the functions they perform in the life of the church? So do they enable the church to flourish, or do they contribute to some kind of illness within the church and then they get tossed out?
Well, I think that is really a very perceptive question. I think that you're quite right to say that the church has always said, look, this approach enables us to flourish. This one here stunts us, it's toxic. And that's a very important criterion. But I think we can go further than that. I think what we can say is that the Christian church always has this practice of looking back and rethinking and saying, is there something in our past that maybe stopped being used because things had changed, but might be now there's a moment in our life as a community or individuals where it could be used again. It kind of way has become relevant all over again. So you have this really interesting, if you like, theology of retrieval, whereby you suddenly say, what Augustine said about this, I mean, people didn't use it very much in the past, but actually its moment has come because it really helps us with this particular problem. So if you like, because Christianity has such a rich heritage, it's always looking back, not because it's kind of hankering after a bygone world, because it's saying, because there's gold in those hills, we can go back there and in fact say this has a new lease of life because it helps us with this problem we now have, and actually Augustine's seen the answer and we can just take him and develop him in order to look at this. So it's a very rich process, which means that doctrine is always something living. It's not words, it's a greater reality, and the question is always finding the best form of words to allow that reality to be brought to bear wherever we find ourselves.
You mentioned, and you look at also in your book, the evolution and the development of Christian doctrine versus scientific theories. Do you think there is a connection between those two trajectories?
I think there is, and I think it's a natural human tendency to look at a body of observations or a body of facts and say, Can we go further than this? What holds them together? How can we think this through? And if you want to go back to Aristotle's natural philosophy, that's exactly what you see. It's basically observations, standing back and saying, what's the bigger picture? And I think the human instinct to find a bigger picture is just natural. So it expresses itself one way in the natural sciences and another way in theology, but actually it really is the same sense-making instinct being applied in each case. And that to me really says that actually we should expect some sort of parallel between development of doctrine, development of scientific theories, and actually more than that, they might actually illuminate each other. They might be helpful to explore those parallels.
How do you see how they could illuminate each other? In what ways could they do that?
I think what we see is a theme that's really important. If you can find a bigger picture which seems to connect together things that otherwise might be disparate and disconnected, it actually gives you this sense of a bigger, more coherent world. Whether it's the world of things about God and salvation, or whether it's the world of how fishes swim in the Aegean Sea. The point is, it enriches us and gives a bigger vision of reality, and that actually makes us feel we've achieved something very significant, which helps us to exist as human beings meaningfully in this world.
Okay, I think this anticipates the next question. You engage with Mary Midgley. Who is she and why is she important to your work?
Well, during the Second World War, there were 4 really interesting women philosophers here in Oxford. And the reason they achieved such prominence in Oxford at the time was everyone else was fighting in the war. So you have Mary Midgley, you have Iris Murdoch, you have Elizabeth Anscombe, and you have Mary Warnock, all here at the same time studying philosophy. And so if you like, they began to really raise some very interesting questions. I fix on Mary Midgley because in many ways she's engaging very similar questions to mine. And Midgley really is asking this. When we look at something that is really complex, like, for example, the world around us, or indeed the nature of God, are we simply forced to produce a number of unintegrated, disconnected statements? Or is there a way of bringing these together in a united whole? It's a very important question, and her answer is to say, think of using multiple maps, which in effect allow you to see how different areas of life, areas of human thought can be interconnected with each other. And she does that remarkably well, and also it's just a very easy and very natural analogy to use. So I have to say I borrowed that, although I have to say I asked her if that was all right, because she and I both are quite critical of Richard Dawkins, and when I was giving a course of lectures up in Newcastle some years ago, she asked me to come and have tea with her and talk about these things, and we had a very good conversation, and she gave me her blessing to use her ideas in the field of science religion, so I was very pleased about it. Also, there's something else about her. I mean, both Mary Midgley and I are professionals, a philosopher, a theologian. Actually, we're better known at a more popular level, each of us, than in the academic level, because we've both deliberately chosen to say we've got to talk to ordinary people, and so we have a kindred notion of accountability to a wider public, which is very important.
You've just served as the Andreas Idreos Professor of Science and Religion here at Oxford, and you've recently retired. What next for you?
Well, it was a great privilege to be the Andreas Idreos Professor of Science and Religion here at Oxford. I had some wonderful students. But I also had an awful lot of administrative responsibilities, meetings to attend, and what I found was I wasn't really able to do the research I'd hoped to. And so what I've discovered is that, in effect, I have a new lease of life because I have 0 meetings now, and I can really map out having full days where I can just think and write. And so you begin to put together complicated projects like the book, The Nature of Christian Doctrine, which is very complex. You need to actually bring together a whole lot of stuff. And so what I'm finding is that in my, I suppose is the final stage of my academic career, I am able to write more, think more, and speak more than I ever have before. So if you like, it's a very nice situation to be in.
Well, thank you for making the time to be on Phil-Sci-Theo, and I've really enjoyed being one of those students. It's been a real privilege. Thank you very much, Professor McGrath.
Well, thank you very much for a very enjoyable conversation.